Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about how you can turn your emotional shit into fertilizer for success and see your darkest moments as opportunities to transform into a powerful kindness warrior. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen. Welcome, Ira Chaleff, to the Ruthless Compassion podcast.
Thank you.
I always like to ask my guests to give a little thumbnail bio of themselves for the listener so that the listener can know who you are and what you do.
All right. I'm a writer. I'm a poet and a nonfiction writer. I moved to Washington, D.C. about 40 years ago. So a lot of my work in coaching, training, organizational development was with political offices. That's good because at a very early age, when I learned of my grandmother's loss of her family in the Holocaust, I became really enamored of the thought, how does this happen? How do political leaders get away with things like that? And what might we be able to do differently? I don't have any final answers. Each generation will have to find some more answers. But I've devoted my adult life to examining those questions and writing about them. So I'm now at the point where my work is well established. There are groups all around the globe, actually, that have taken these ideas and translated them into their own cultures. And now I'm in sort of the legacy state where any other ideas that I can offer to those interested in these topics, that's my work right now.
Okay. So why don't we talk about your ideas? Like, I know you said you were working with political people and you were starting to think about why bad things are allowed to happen. But what are your thoughts in terms of how we deal with difficult people in positions of political power? How did you come to those thoughts and what are the thoughts?
If I may, I'd like to step back just a bit, because dealing with political people, with difficult political people, is an extension of dealing with people and dealing with people in all parts of our lives. And we always have at least two vectors in dealing with people. One, how can we support what they are doing that is beneficial to themselves and us and others? And the other is, how can we, if need be, set up boundaries for ourselves so things that they're doing that may be detrimental to us do not affect us more than they should? And how might we even potentially create a relationship where we can give gentle, sometimes fierce feedback that helps them to see into their blind spots and choose whether or not it's in their own self-interest to attempt to change their behavior. As you know, none of these are easy, but this is a general outline of what my work is trying to do.
Okay. So I just have a question that came to mind right away because I've done many years as a psychotherapist, and I've certainly learned about a lot of different kinds of people. And there are certainly a group of people, let's call them people with personality disorders, whose behavior is quite rigid, who tend to be quite defensive, who tend to assign blame to others and not be able to take responsibility for their own actions. And so these people are not generally amenable to hearing constructive feedback, even if given in the most positive and gentle way, and who are generally unable, unwilling to change or to even see that they need to change. It's others who need to change, not themselves. So when we are confronted with a person like that in our personal or professional or political life, what is your suggestion? Because, I've had suggestions in terms of my psychotherapy practice, but what are your thoughts on a person like that?
So again, I'm going to just take a couple of steps back to try to answer that from the framework of my work. In my work, we are dealing with authority relationships. In other words, almost all of my work is in the workplace, whether that's a political or non-political workplace. And there is a power imbalance by reason of the hierarchy. Unfortunately, too many of us will conclude that the titular leader or manager has all the power and we have to conform. That's never true. We always have certain sources of power. It could be our knowledge base, our reputation, our integrity, our history of already being tested by fire. So when I work with my clients, which is not on a therapy basis, but it's on a coaching basis and a training basis, we're looking at inspecting beliefs that may not be serving them well, that they have to acquiesce when they don't necessarily have to acquiesce. They have to think strategically.
Right.
What is the right time to speak up? What is the right place? What is the right voice to use? Sometimes the voice is diplomatic. Sometimes it's very assertive. There's a lot of context that comes into this. So, and you'll appreciate this, there isn't a simple answer. There are a range of answers. And it starts with becoming aware of ourselves. What is our default mode? When does that serve us well? And when doesn't it? And how can we start to move out of our comfort zone and use other modes of interacting with what you're describing as difficult people, and I'm perhaps talking about difficult bosses.
Okay. But if you have, again, I'm going to reiterate, if you have somebody who is entrenched, let's say, they're not going to change. So if you say, whatever you say to them, we have an issue, blah, 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 and they don't want to hear it, they don't want to know, they're not interested in doing anything themselves, whatever the problem is, we ourselves are the ones who have to fix it. When confronting somebody like that, who is not going to take any responsibility for their behavior and putting everything onto us, what are some things that we can consider or do in dealing with a person like that in a position of power or authority?
While we may feel trapped economically in a situation, if we do have any options whatsoever, we always then have the option of leaving. I know it's easier to say than to do for different people in different circumstances, but it's an important option because otherwise it's like staying in an abusive marriage. There are a lot of reasons to stay in an abusive marriage, but it's not healthy to stay. Well, it's similar in the workplace, but short of that, again, let's step back. All people, all of us have self-interest. Yes, we're there to work together for whatever purpose that group or organization are there to serve, or products to make, or things to sell. Yes. And we also have self-interest. The leader has self-interest. If we can frame our feedback, our observations, our suggestions in terms of what they perceive to be their self-interest, they may begin paying attention. There are no guarantees, but this is one of the tools in our kit, one of the approaches in our kit.
That's so interesting because that's something I've advised my patients to do in psychotherapy. When you're dealing with a narcissist, frame it in a way that they see it's going to benefit them because they're always focused on their own self-interest. So that's a way to, get their attention.
Yes. Now, interestingly, in my first book, which is really the book that has gone around the world in many languages and become a basis for many doctoral dissertations, etc., I do talk about balancing supporting the leader with challenging them. You must develop some basis of support where they value you, if you even have the right to challenge them, but certainly if your challenge is going to be at all effective. They have to understand that you bring a lot to them and their work. So we start there because I have found that there's too much cynicism in the workplace? It's too easy to write off your boss or your boss's boss. It's kind of socially acceptable. And I reject that. I think as mature individuals, we have to start with the premise they're human like we are. They have strengths, they have flaws. We have strengths, we have flaws. How do we use our strengths to compensate for or minimize their flaws? Let's start with that. Just the way they are probably doing some of that with us. How collectively can we build a team where our collective strengths are well utilized and our collective flaws are kept in check? So that's the basis for healthy group dynamics.
I do a lot of assessments on people who are off work because of mental health reasons. And a lot of the people I've interviewed are what we call burnt out. And a lot of these individuals have a pattern that I've noticed of overfunctioning, putting in too much effort and energy and time, and exhausting themselves, depleting themselves. And then something happens in the workplace where they're feeling particularly unappreciated or misused. And then they have a breakdown because after all this time of doing so much, and they feel like the payoff didn't come, they didn't get the appreciation, they didn't get valued the way they thought, they got taken advantage of or disrespected, and then they collapse. The people pleaser in the workplace. And I've seen that over and over again. And I realized how, that role is a role that we learn in childhood in our family dynamics. But when we bring it into the workplace, it does not result in us being respected or valued, and it doesn't give us the power to negotiate our needs. It really sets us up as someone who's always going to be taken advantage of and disrespected. And so these individuals, they don't get what they're hoping for by doing this dynamic. Have you noticed something similar?
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's kind of the good news, because what we need to change is not the leader's behavior, but ours. And then the leader will need to respond to the change in our behavior. I've seen in my work, and I use it as an example, let's say you have an executive assistant who has a child in daycare. They have to pick up the child at 5 o'clock. Otherwise, it's $5 every minute they're late. The child is upset, that kind of thing. And they have a very good boss, or maybe not so good a boss, but the boss values them. But too often, like at 20 to 5, the boss says, "Oh, could you just do this one more thing for me before you go?" And they say yes, and then they're late. So what we do is we do role plays. We say, "I need you to understand that I need to pick up my child at 5 where I have significant penalties. So if you need me to do something today, I need you to give me the work by 4:30, and I will get it done, if at all possible, before I leave. If it comes in later, you'll need to give it to someone else, or I'll do it first thing in the morning." And the boss says, "Oh, sure, no problem." 3 days later, they forget. And at, 20 to 5, they say, "Oh, could you please just do this?" What does the follower need to do? They absolutely need to say, "I'm sorry, we talked about this. I can't do that. I'll do it first thing in the morning." And that's what changes the behavior. But they have to be willing to change their behavior there.
Yeah, that's what I call practicing ruthless compassion, because you have to be able to be strong enough to set limits and to reiterate your original statement so that you maintain your credibility, and to tolerate the potential that the person that you're confronting is going to be angry or disappointed with you.
Absolutely. Now, see, all of this range of behavior we're talking about now, I cover in great depth in my book, The Courageous Follower. And, literally thousands and thousands of people have written or told me about how it has made such a dramatic difference in their lives. What I'm trying to do now is take it a step up, which is more difficult, to how do we do this in the political arena, and especially in the senior levels of the political arena. I've worked with about 100 congressional offices, both Democrat and Republican. I directed a nonpartisan nonprofit It helps members of Congress run their offices better so they serve their constituents better. And one of the things I've found is that the staff have to learn how to manage the member. So we can do that. But now, if you ratchet it up to the next level, and let me say, in reality, many can do that. There are a few members who have the personality type that you described that it never took. And they eventually paid a price for it at times, public embarrassment, the member with the most staff turnover, this kind of thing. But now what I'm trying to do is take this up another step. How do we, as citizens, or even as non-citizens, but as people who, are living in this country, how do we work with the political leaders so that the dynamics of their blind spots and their inappropriate ruthlessness, let me call it that, how could we have an effect on that? Well, again, there's no easy answer. And what I do in this current book, To Stop a Tyrant, The Power of Political Followers, is I look at where are you in relation to the political leader. You could visualize circles around the leader. The inmost circle are their confidants. They have perhaps a lot of power to do the kinds of things we've been talking about. That doesn't mean they're necessarily going to use that power. And in my book, I encourage them to examine why they wouldn't and how it's a disservice, both to themselves, to the leader, and the polity. But then there are circles outside. There are the elite circle, there's the bureaucratic circle, there are the activist circles, and there's the rest of us, the rest of the population.
There's also the journalist circles, the papers and the TV programs that can either be sycophants or that can speak truth to power.
Absolutely. And the very senior journalists I put in the elite circle, the ones who are perhaps not as prominent, they have podcasts or what have you, that don't have hundreds of thousands of followers, but they can often be in the activist circle because they have a little bit more leeway to speak their truth, if you will. So in each of these circles, I look at the dynamics of what would keep us from speaking up and how might we perform that role differently and what channels would we use. So, for example, if you're at a political rally with 10,000 other people, you can't say to the candidate, well, you should do this differently. You're one of 10,000. But you still have power, because if they say something that you can really get behind, you cheer and you applaud. And if they say something that you think is morally indefensible or really problematic, don't applaud and cheer just because peers are. Fold your arms and stand there. Send a signal of non-agreement, of disapproval. What does that do? It gives the person next to you, on either side of you, a little courage that if they don't agree with something, they'll do that. These are the kinds of things we have to look at that send a message to the candidate that, if everybody cheers when they say something really problematic, they go, wow, that works, I'm going to keep doing that. Whereas if the cheering is very muted, or even, I don't like booing, but, that is one option, but very muted, they have to rethink it. Well, that didn't go down very well. I better think about where I stand on that and maybe revise that. So we have power no matter how distant we are, but we have to use it consciously.
And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. Since I was a kid, I've loved watching movies. As a psychiatrist, I'm blown away by how film touches us at our core, deepens our self-knowledge, and can improve the human condition. I wanted to let listeners know that I've started a new podcast called Real Mental with Dr. Marcia Sirota. I'm going to be talking with directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health on the big and small screen. Some recent films covered are Anora, Emilia Perez, Will and Harper, and The Last Showgirl. Please subscribe to Real Mental on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. I was just talking to a friend of mine who lives in the United States, and he was telling me that he had noticed that one of the major newspapers has changed its tone of reporting. Earlier, it was being very, very tolerant and accepting and even encouraging of some political policies that a lot of people were having problems with. And my friend pulled their subscription, which they'd had for decades. And then they noticed just recently that this major newspaper has changed its tone and it was being a little bit more realistic, let's say, in the way it was covering things. And I said, it sounds like you weren't the only one who pulled your subscription. And in their own self-interest, they might have said, maybe we need to change the way we report. And I thought that's a way that people can have power, just, like with your wallet, right? Just like here in Canada, we are boycotting a lot of American-made products. In Ontario, where I live, they are no longer selling American liquor. And so, that's making a statement. So there are ways that we can, just with our purchasing power, make statements that affect the political world.
Yeah, I was in Toronto not too long ago and found you couldn't get Kentucky bourbon.
No more. We get Canadian rye.
Right. Yeah. I want to be clear that I'm not Pollyannish. I don't think doing these things is necessarily going to change anything. But why is it important? Too many people I know, I do live here in America, and too many people I know are feeling helpless. Well, that's not a healthy place for any of us to be in any aspect of our lives. So we have to step back and think, okay, well, how do I find agency again? Now, here's where I think we could bring into the conversation your ideas about compassionate ruthlessness. Because I am no fan at all of polarization. If I have friends on the progressive side who all they do is trash what people on the conservative side are thinking, saying, or doing, I'm saying you're speaking to the choir and you're not being serious about trying to engage anyone in a way that they may let down their guard and have a mature conversation that perhaps can start shifting perspectives. And if you're not willing to do it, why do you expect that those on the other side would be willing to do it? It starts with you. So I hope they're fierce kindness, but it's too easy to lose our compassion. Why do people who vote radically differently than you do, why do they do that? Aren't you curious about that? Wouldn't it be good to understand that more deeply so that as you formulate your strategy of how you can have agency, you take that into account rather than just running up against a brick wall? This is true in relationships as well, but this book, To Stop a Tyrant, The Power of Political Followers, is committed to trying to bring these principles into the larger political arena.
So since you're talking about to stop a tyrant, let's talk about what is a tyrant, because maybe people aren't really clear what that means.
Yes, that's excellent. I wasn't either until I did my research, because it turns out, first of all, that a dictator and a tyrant are not the same. And what I learned was that in ancient Rome, the Senate would confer the role of dictator on an individual when there was an existential crisis threatening Rome. And they gave them complete carte blanche to do what was needed to resolve the crisis, but only for 6 months. They could ask for an extension, but usually the expectation was you get this done in less than 6 months. And then you go back to the republic and the rules of the republic, not to a dictatorship. What would go wrong is when the dictator got a taste of this unitary power and refused to give up power. And then they became tyrannical. And tyrannical was not just the unitary decision making, but it was doing so in ways that were deeply corrupt, that were
Self-serving.
oppressive, cruel, random, these kinds of things.
Sounds
So,
familiar.
now, but going beyond that, I actually created another word. I don't like creating words usually, but this one seems to flow off the tongue and people get it quickly. And that's a proto-tyrant. What's a proto-tyrant? It's similar to a prototype. It is a prototype. A prototype is an early version of something or someone. Now, in our system, for example, you can say the president is a tyrant, but he's not. He doesn't have that total unlimited power yet, certainly. So it's more accurate to look at him as a proto-tyrant. Now, many of us could have proto-tyrannical aspects to our personality. The problem becomes when we actually get sufficient power to inflate that tendency. Now, this is where followers come in critically, because followers have to recognize, the signs, which are not very subtle, and need to understand there's a window where the person may be acting as though they're a tyrant, but they don't have that complete power. The courts are still standing up to them. There are independent newspapers standing up to them. There are rallies standing up to them, etc. During that window, one has to act. Now, what action you take will depend on, to some degree, where you are in proximity to the leader, and, interestingly, where you are in terms of politically. Do you oppose them or support them? I feel it is even more important for those who support the leader to be acting in that window to check proto-tyrannical tendencies, because they're the ones more likely to have an effect on the leader. So this is what I look at. I'm not an academic. I have deep, deep roots in working in the real world, in Congress, in federal agencies, and globally in democratic countries that are evolving to democracies or more stable democracies. So my book is full of, I hope, insights into what would keep us from passively colluding with this behavior and what would support us courageously doing what we can to check it while it is still checkable.
Okay, so this is what I'm perceiving. And, you can correct me if I'm wrong because number one, I'm not American. Number two, you're much closer to that world than I am. But what I'm perceiving is that a lot of people around the proto-tyrant are sycophantic, are fawning over them, are afraid to say anything because of the rage that will be directed at them, the punishment that will be directed at them if they disagree or challenge the proto-tyrant in any way. And so the likelihood of someone in their inner circle or, who supports them of opposing anything, to me seems less so because this particular proto-tyrant has demonstrated such a vindictiveness and such a thin skin and such an inability to tolerate any feedback that they don't like. I mean, they're firing people illegally in the Federal Reserve, right? They're firing people who they're not politically permitted to fire, but firing anyway. So it makes me think that, it's very, very hard. And we see that the people who have opposed them, like John Bolton's house gets raided by the FBI, people get severe punishment for in any way standing up to them. So how do people, stand up to somebody like this when they see everywhere real clear in the world consequences of opening your mouth and saying, well.
So you're hitting the nub of the issue. There are three types of follower behavior: conformist, where may not like it, but you have other things to do in life. You're just going to go along with it. Colluder, where you are actually not just enabling, but even amplifying the proto-tyrannical behavior. And courageous followers who will find times and places and ways of standing up to it. These are often not visible because courageous followership doesn't necessarily seek to embarrass the leader, but seeks to constrain them or transform what's happening. So we may not see the courageous acts occurring. Now, in my book, which was written before this election in the United States, I took a classic example of Watergate, where President Richard Nixon, he covered up a crime, and he then he did fire the special prosecutor who was investigating the crime. What happened was that his attorney general and the deputy attorney general and others immediately resigned. So, in other words, they didn't leave this one person to hang out to dry on their own. Now, the downside of that is now the people with integrity have resigned. And it creates a vacuum for more people with questionable integrity. But not really, because the media then picks this up. And suddenly, there's an awareness. Wait a second. Why did all the senior Justice Department political appointees, good Republicans, why did they do this? Why did they resign? And we know the outcome, but I take this apart in my book to show how followers at all different levels played their part in ensuring that this proto-tyrannical act did not become ensconced tyranny. Now, you've got to be willing to stand in the heat. You've got to be willing. But again, let's go back to self-interest. Lawyers know that they are sworn to uphold the law and the Constitution. And if they can be charged with egregiously and knowingly violating it, they will lose their license to practice law. They'll be disbarred. Now, well, that's not going to happen now, is it? All the chips are stacked. It's not going to happen now, but history has a funny way of wending and weaving its way. And therefore, just from terms of self-interest, people who generally support the president, who feel that the system does need shaking up, but who are committed to making sure this is done within the confines of the law, this is their time, whether it's behind the scenes or publicly, stand up. Not in opposition to the policies, because look, we have to acknowledge that a majority of our population voted for these policies, more or less. They were democratically elected. Now, the problem is when they have the power of government and all of the levers of government, do they start to misuse that, abuse that, and tyrannically employ that? We have a vantage point where we can say, it's already happening here, it's happening there, it's happening here. Others can say, yeah, but look where it's stopped here, it's been stopped here, it's been stopped here. There's quite a battle going on. And it isn't even a political battle in terms of conservatism and progressivism. It's how far do we support the clumsy democratic processes of creating change? And how far do we say, no, we need authoritarian style rule to actually get anything done? It's a very serious question. It's not a new question. It's a question that has surfaced throughout history in different countries, governments, eras. That's what we're watching now. And as followers on either side, again, my call for action is stay alert, make sure that you're going to be able to live with what you did or didn't do 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. Now is the time.
It's funny, I was talking to that same friend who lives in the United States, and he was saying how there are certain populations who were, voting for this current administration, and they were thinking, well, the bad stuff isn't going to happen to me, and then the bad stuff is happening to them, and they were going like, oh, I didn't think it was going to happen to me. And he was naming off various groups who were very clearly like, you know, yes, but it's not going to happen to me. And now they're actually having very serious, dire consequences. So, you know, it's very easy for us at times to think this isn't going to happen to me, and then it is. And the other thing I wanted to say apropos of that is how all these people who are supporting the president have this fascinating amnesia, in my opinion, because we look at the way people who have been in the inner circle have fared, and the vast majority of them have been, you know, treated very, very poorly and have become very disillusioned and, you know, have been excommunicated from the inner circle and, you know, are having raids of their homes and things like that. So being close to that power, even if you haven't really done anything quote unquote wrong, according to the person in charge, it's a very dangerous role. And these people seem to have total denial, like, oh, it's not going to happen to me, right? It's like, this isn't going to happen to me, but it keeps happening. And so what I'm seeing is among the population, like, it's not going to happen to me, all the bad stuff. It's going to happen to the other guy, and that's fine because I'm going to get what I want. Untrue. And then the people in the inner circle, well, this is not going to happen to me. I'm going to be the exception. Untrue. People are in this enormous amount of denial that all these bad things they're going to be immune from. And then when they experience it, oh, well, too late, then the next person comes in to fill their spot. So I'm not sure how we deal with this kind of pervasive degree of denial. It seems quite remarkable to me.
Yes. Again, I go into this in serious depth in my book. Power is seductive. Being close to power is seductive. In the circle of elites, I take a look at various times in history where elites thought that they could support an autocratic leader, thinking, well, you know, they're just what we need. They're going to get our work done. They believe they can keep controlling the leader until a leader turns around and controls them. As a contemporary example, I use Putin with Khodorkovsky, who became the richest of all the oligarchs in Russia. And then he criticized Putin. And the next thing you know, he had a 14-year jail sentence and all his wealth was stripped from him. This is what happens when you allow anyone in any system to get absolute power. It's happened throughout history. It's very sad. It's happened on the left. Like you take Nicaragua, you know, where people gave their lives and fortunes to overthrow Somoza, the brutal dictator, and they supported the Sandinistas, and, you know, and now the former Sandinista leader is the new dictator. And almost all of the people who worked to overthrow the Somoza regime are either in jail or been killed or exiled. This is an historical pattern. And what I'm trying to do in this book is not look at the United States at this time. I'm looking at these dynamics throughout human history in every society. I was looking at China and how, you know, Mao would raise up a couple of people to be his deputies and then put them down into exile because as soon as anyone, well, we can even look at Elon Musk in a sense, as soon as anyone gets too close to the power that the proto-tyrant has, they need to do something about it. They don't want anyone else to be sharing the limelight or potentially to be able to succeed them. So my point is that there's a trap here for us in the United States now, which is people on the left are so affronted by the policies that they are spending huge amounts of energy speaking against them, which is their right to do. But it's not what's the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is the overconcentration of power in the administration, in any administration. And this is, again, my book is fiercely, pristinely nonpartisan. intentionally so, because I want people on any point of the political spectrum to be able to examine where do they fit in this and what can they potentially do to make a difference.
You know, you started out this conversation talking about how people have self-interest and that we need to point out, where they're not acting in their own self-interest perhaps. And, there's been this conference going on, I'm sure you're aware, where China has welcomed North Korea and Russia and other countries, India, and they just had a big, huge military parade where China was showing its military might and basically saying, look, United States, look, rest of the world, the West is going down. We are rising up. And they're sort of thumbing their nose at the United States in particular and this current administration. And I find it very interesting how, while the American policies are causing such a disruption in all the allegiances, all the alliances between United States and Europe, United States and Canada, United States and South America, all the countries that used to be aligned with the US are now in conflict. And now that the United States has fractured all of these relationships, it has emboldened and empowered these other alliances. And I just think that it's like the law of unintended consequences, right?
I think it could be the law of unintended consequences. I think it's even more than that. I think it's for every action there's a reaction.
Yes.
And we're back to Newtonian physics. And this is why my friends who are so anxious that it's absolutely unhealthy, I try to help them get some perspective, some distance. Nothing ever stays the same. All of these actions are also rubbing different interest groups, factions, etc., in the wrong way. And there will be a point where there's the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, a lot of damage could be done before then to our constitutional order. But I perhaps am an inveterate optimist. So what I'm thinking is, our constitutional system here in the United States really had deep contradictions. And we got away with it for 250 years. Now something has challenged those, and they're really being exposed in ways we can't ignore. So, however this plays out, and when the dust settles, we will need to do a serious improvement on our constitutional norms, and maybe we need some more amendments to make sure that the weaknesses that have been exposed do not continue to be vulnerable. So in a way, I look at this as the body politic is getting an infection. And what does an infection do? It causes the body to develop new antibodies to meet it. But it takes a while for that to happen. And it is a struggle between the virus and the antibodies. But I believe that there's a very good chance the antibodies will develop sufficiently strong enough. We'll come back to some sort of balance, and then we will work to improve the system. And guess what? The things that have occurred will not have all been bad. For example, it's not bad that the current administration has acted in ways that requires Europe to become more responsible for its own defense. That's a good thing. It's not bad that we look at, this goes back to deep political theory, 100 years old, that all bureaucracies tend to become too big, unwieldy, and somewhat out of control. And at times, the great social political theorist Max Weber said, at times a charismatic leader is needed to help bring the bureaucracies back into the right size relative to the elected government. Some of that, it's occurring in very problematic ways that there'll be repair being needed. But it won't all have been a negative. There will be ways with, well, okay, how do we rethink this? So Where I go, and this doesn't make me terribly popular on either side of the political spectrum, but where I go is we need political maturity to understand this moment in history. It's not the worst moment in history. Go look at our parents and grandparents who lived through the Nazification and fascist and Mao's period and Stalin's period. It is not by far the worst period in history. It doesn't absolve us from being responsive to it, but it does us no good to break down into hyper anxiety. Instead, step back, take a perspective, take a look at what your work to do, and do that. And I hope that my books help in that regard.
So interesting. It's really been fun talking with you today. I wanted to ask you my last three questions. So the first question is, where can people find you if they're interested in looking at your books or in learning more about what you do?
Well, the biggest challenge is the spelling of my name. I hope you'll put it up somewhere. So it's Ira Chaleff, and I have a website, irachaleffauthor.com. It's got my books, my videos. There's some free downloads for parents. There's a lot of material there. If you don't remember my name, but you remember The Courageous Follower, or you remember To Stop a Tyrant, I'll show up immediately. I've kind of been blessed. I've never found another person on earth with the same name as me.
It's lucky.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you my second question now, which is, what are you working on right now? What are you up to these days?
I'm completing my fifth collection of poetry, and I will be self-publishing it this month in preparation to give as gifts on my 80th birthday. And the
Congratulations.
poetry collection is 80 and in Love.
Oh, lovely. And for the final question, what is your call to action for the listeners today?
It's to not give up on the policies you feel need to be resisted or supported, but at the same time go deeper and look at, in our democracy and in many democracies, what is needed to develop a position of empathy for those who radically disagree with you. And think about where there is common ground, and there's always common ground, and find ways that you may use that common ground to make a difference. For example, there's a group in the United States that has small groups everywhere called, now I'm going to mess up their title, I think it's Our Better Angels, but it's something with angels. And these are groups where people, progressives and conservatives, meet together to talk and listen respectfully to each other. Find groups like that, create groups like that, encourage your elected officials in Canada, in the United States, in Poland, wherever you are, to find ways to work across the aisle. I am aware of all the structural impediments for doing that. Nevertheless, it can be done.
In the aim of not having one person or two people having all the power and, being able to wreak havoc on this society and globally.
Correct. And that's, there's nothing more American than that, because that's exactly what the founding fathers of the United States tried their very best to do. They were intensely aware of the dangers of the over concentration of power and the tendency for democracies to eventually again become tyrannies, as happened in Athens, as happened in Rome. And they did their very best, but a paper document has no life of its own. It's us. It's the living, breathing, caring participants in our time in the world that need to find a way to make our difference.
Well, that's wonderful. Ira Chaleff, thank you so much for coming on the Ruthless Compassion podcast today. It's been really interesting talking to you, and I hope the listeners get a lot out of this.
Thanks so much.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests, so please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com.